Hello, dear sewistas! Today, I would like to sew this cool shirt with you. The flattering folds along the side are created simply through the cut. No elastics or complicated ruffles necessary. During this tutorial, I will show you how to work with knit fabrics, such as jersey, the different seam types available on a normal sewing machine, as well as on a serger machine. You can find the link to the pattern available in varying sizes on my website, pattydoo. Because I need a little space to cut both pieces, I'll show you how on the floor. The fabric I'm going to recommend is a soft flowing jersey. Of course, you could also use an interlock, which is easier to work with, but doesn't fall quite so softly. The fabric width should ideally be 1.5 meters or 1.7 yards. The length depends on your garment size. For my size 38, I need a length of 1.1 meters or 1.2 yards. If your fabric puckers slightly around the edges like mine is doing, cut a few notches around the edges so it lies nice and flat. When cutting knit fabric, it's very important the material is lying flat without being stretched. For example, it shouldn't be hanging over the edge of a table. I have already cut and assembled the pattern pieces for my size here. It includes both parts, the front with a plunging neckline and the back panel with a high neckline. First, we will cut the back piece. This fabric is great because I can use the stripes as orientation. The cut also really accentuates them. Of course, you can also use a solid color or a different pattern. I've laid the back piece as close as possible to the edge. This way, the top corners of the neckline are perfectly in line on the same stripe. The straight grain runs this way and is parallel to the selvage. To make sure both panels fit side by side on the fabric, I've laid a ruler at the hem of my back piece. Now, I take the pattern piece and turn it over, with the printed side down, since the front part has to be cut mirror image. So lay it on the fabric like this. As you can see, everything fits great. Now you can weigh down your back piece and trace it, or secure it with a few pins and cut it out, like I am doing. The pattern already includes the hem and seam allowance, so you can cut directly along the edge of the pattern. The back piece is finished. Next, we can cut the front piece. Before we do that, we have to cut off this top area from our pattern with some paper scissors. As I've already mentioned, the front pattern piece is placed on the fabric with the printed side face down, or mirror image. To save some fabric, I'm also going to rotate it once. However, if you are using fabric with a pattern that runs directional from top to bottom, you cannot turn your second piece by 180 degrees. As with the back piece, I ensure that the corners of the front part's neckline are on the same height on the same stripe. Now, we pin this in place and cut it out. In addition to our two pieces, we now also need a long strip for our neckline. You can either use a contrasting fabric or, like me, make it from the same fabric. The strip should be 3 centimeters or 1 1/4 inches wide and 70 to 75 centimeters or about 30 inches long. It is easiest to cut using a rotary cutter and a patchwork ruler. I'm going to cut the fabric so the colored stripe will later be visible on the outside. Now all our pattern pieces have been cut and we can prepare our fabric strips, iron them, and then begin sewing. Jersey, unfortunately, has the annoying tendency to roll in around the edges. This is why I'm going to iron the strip intended for the neckline now, fold it over once, and secure it with a few pins. Then I'll leave it to cool until it's time to use it. Before we proceed with the nicest part of our project, I would like to give you a few pointers on sewing with knit fabrics. First of all, it's very important that you have the right sewing machine needle. Use a stretch needle to ensure the fabric won't be damaged. While sewing the seams, it's important that you use a high density stitch and that the thread tension isn't set too high. For example, there are far fewer stitches in this length of this simple seam than there are in the same length when using a closely set zigzag stitch. So, if I stretch the fabric with the simple seam, there is no give and the thread rips. However, the high stitch density of the zigzag is more flexible and stretchy, and thus better suited for sewing knit fabrics. The last point depends on your sewing machine and whether you have the option of lessening the pressure of the presser foot. Sometimes there's a little wheel up here to change the setting. Or perhaps you even have the possibility of a top feed setting. The first step consists of sewing together a shoulder seam of the front and back pieces. Ensure the pieces are lying right sides together and secure them with a few pins. For the shoulder seam, I'm going to use an elastic stitch, the overlock stitch of my machine together with a suitable presser foot. Why don't you have a look and see what options your machine offers? If there are none, then just use the closely set zigzag stitch I showed you earlier. But definitely try it on a spare piece of your fabric first before you start sewing your pretty t-shirt. I won't be finishing these seams because since the stitches are so tightly set, it's very unlikely they will unravel. So, if you've experimented a little with your stitch density and have found a suitable setting, then your first seam should be fine and you can continue working in that setting. Now, we are going to sew the neckline. In order to do this, we are now going to pin our folded fabric strip to the neckline's edge, both onto the front and back piece. The open ends will later be sewn into the second shoulder seam. To make it easier, I have put some pins in the strip. And because I want the neon stripe to be visible on the outside of the shirt, I will lay that stripe on the right side of my shirt. Now, secure the strip with pins around the edge of the neckline. In doing so, we will stretch it a bit, particularly along the curve, to ensure it does not flop to the outside later. I have intentionally secured the pins on the stripe side because this is where I will be sewing later, so I can stretch the strip even more if necessary. When sewing the neckline, especially if you have never sewn one before, it is very important to do a practice one first, which means try sewing a fabric strip onto a curve like you will be doing on your t-shirt. The elasticity of your fabric will determine how much the strip needs to be stretched in order to lie nice and flat. Be sure to only stretch the strip, not the underlying neckline edge of the shirt. This is what my neckline looks like now. I know this step is not very easy and it might take you a couple of tries before you are satisfied because it does take a bit of practice. However, it's also not rocket science. So, next we can iron our neckline and top stitch around its edge. Now, I top stitch along the edge of the neckline so the seam allowance can't fold out later. Since my neckline is quite big, it won't be stretched very much, and I can use a normal back stitch with a smaller stitch length. I chose length number 2, but you could alternatively use a zigzag stitch or another decorative stitch. Next, we are going to sew our second shoulder seam and the 2 side seams. You can sew these with a regular sewing machine and the same stitch you used earlier. Or I can show you now how to do it with a serger machine. Once again, lay your pieces together, right sides together. This time, I secured the pins lengthwise to the seam, so they don't damage the blade of the serger machine, which they would if I inserted them crosswise. This is what my 4th thread overlock stitch looks like, with an integrated safety seam, which means I can sew and serge at the same time. After sewing the shoulder seam, I'm going to move onto the side seams. In order to do so, I'm going to secure them with a few pins. So, this is what the two sealed seams look like. Now, we are only missing the hems on the sleeves and down here. A cover lock machine would be best suited, but we're just going to go ahead with a normal sewing machine. You can use different stitch types for your seams. It all depends on the options provided by your machine. Of course, also the stitches here need to be stretchy. For example, you could use a twin needle and a simple backstitch. You could also go for a zigzag stitch or perhaps a tripartite zigzag stitch. I have the option of a triple backstitch, which I will be using. The pattern gives 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch hem allowance, which I will now fold over in all openings. But before, I'll turn the t-shirt inside out. Now, the right fabric side is on the outside, and I'll fold the 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch inwards and secure it from the outside with some pins. Now you could iron it if you fancy. This is what the pinned hems look like now. In each case, 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch have been folded over, and I am now going to sew a seam 1.5 centimeters or half an inch from the edge. I am going to start with the sleeves. I am starting my seam here in the armpit and close to the right side, since up here the seam usually looks nicer. If you don't have an indication on your needle plate like I do, I would recommend using some tape to mark the distance of 1.5 centimeters or half an inch to the needle. This triple backstitch allows for 3 times the amount of the thread in the seam, which is why it's so stretchy and perfectly suited for this seam. When sewing the seams, it's important to remember once again, don't stretch the fabric. I'll start sewing the bottom hem just before the side seam. This is what my finished hem seam looks like from the outside and inside. I can shorten this overlapping edge a little. If you don't like the way this looks, use a zigzag stitch. Otherwise, it's not really necessary to tidy this up, since elastic fabrics don't fray like woven fabrics. Of course, a cover seam would be even better since it's nice and clean on the outside and inside, but you need a special cover lock machine for that. Now, we have only 2 minor details to complete, and then we'll be done with our shirt. First, we have to sew up this thread chain from our overlock seam, which I am going to do by hand. We can't just cut it off, because then the seam will unravel. Secondly, we have to iron our seams. So, I'm going to go to the changing room and see if neon yellow even suits me. It does, and not too shabby. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my sewing video and have fun making this t-shirt. Bye, and see you soon.